But we are beginning with chapter 4, and once again we're going to see a theme that's here. And without giving too much away, the theme is about experience. The theme is about how bhakti, devotional consciousness, cannot be understood merely intellectually or even by verbal expression, but in actuality only by experience. And even then, I won't give too much away, but that experience is so subtle that expression of it is almost impossible verbally. So let's begin first with verse 51, chapter 4. Anirvachaniyam prema swarupam. The essential form, swarupam, of pure devotion toward God, prema, is anirvachaniyam, inexpressible. Inexpressible. Now, this is a sutra. This is a sutra, very short, very much to the point. The verb root of anirvachaniyam is vach, meaning essentially to speak, to say. So we have the goddess, for example, Vagdevi, Vach, Vagdevi, the goddess of speech. So very specifically what this is saying by inexpressible is that by human words it is not possible to explain what is the true nature of bhakti, of devotional consciousness. And not just bhakti, but svarupam, in its essential form. In other words, in its deepest essence. So that's how you translate from Sanskrit. That's exactly what this verse is saying in the Sanskrit. The essential form of pure devotion toward God is inexpressible. Now, why is this the case? There's a word in the English language, ineffable. And there's been a debate going on for a very long time about the ineffability of God, the ineffability of anything that is transcendent. By ineffable, what is meant is inexpressible. That is, that God ultimately is a being that cannot be expressed, cannot be explained, that cannot be understood by mere language alone. So this is a concept that we have philosophically in the Western world as well as other places. So this verse here is expressing this exact same idea. That ultimately, if we want to know the inner nature, the inner essence of bhakti itself, what to speak of God, of devotional consciousness toward God, we can't do this through human words alone. Now, why is this the case? Well, this next verse now is going to explain that. So, verse 52. It, and what is meant by it, of course, is the attempt to explain verbally what is bhakti. It would be similar to a mute person attempting to describe what he is tasting. So very vivid, very vivid. When you are tasting something, what are you doing? Are you examining it theoretically? Are you examining it philosophically? Are you thinking about it? What are you doing when you are quite literally tasting? You're experiencing. You're experiencing something. You're experiencing something that has not just a sensation, but more than a sensation. It has an interrelationship with you in such a manner that you are experiencing something that cannot be explained. Thus, if there is a strong sort of food and a person has never tasted it before, and you try to explain, well, it tastes kind of like this, kind of like that, they'll never understand. A perfect example is a mango. Because of all the various sorts of fruits, mango has a very distinct flavor. Very, very distinct. So you can imagine that at one time in Europe, for example, in the 19th century, no one had tasted mango before. No one understood what a mango tasted like. They had tasted other things, apples, various berries, things like that. But mango, they had never tasted. And it's interesting how there would be stories of people who would come back from India, British people who would come back from India, having been there for some time. And they would try to explain to their friends what the taste of a mango was like. And it was impossible. Impossible for them to explain this. Why? Ultimately, it's not a matter of simply verbal expression or verbal or conceptual understanding. It's a matter quite literally of taste. Bhakti, too, is a matter of taste. Devotional consciousness, prema, what is described in verse 51, specifically as prema, that is divine love, pure, absolute divine love, is something that is tasted. It's something that is sweet, very much like a fruit, very much like a mango, very much like honey. This is an example that Prabhupada gave, that many, many gurus gave, actually. And it's a very easy example to understand. You've never tasted honey. Before you, there is a jar of honey. What do? You want to understand what it tastes like. You can examine it, you can talk about it, you can speculate about it, you can have verbal discussions about it, you can have debates about it. But ultimately, you will never understand it. So ultimately, what do you need to do? Something that seems very, very simple, and really in its essence is simple because it's self-explanatory, simple because it's going to the very root of what it means to taste. Ultimately, you open that jar, you take some of that honey, you put it to your mouth, you taste it. Now you understand. Now this is the thing that's interesting. Usually this analogy stops there. Even when Prabhupada gave this analogy, it stopped there. And it made its point. People understood. But I'm going to take the analogy a little bit further. All right, I've never tasted honey before. I speculate about that jar of honey for a year. Finally, I open the jar. Finally, I taste. Finally, I understand. Now I know what honey tastes like. Now I understand the ineffable. Now I want to explain it to someone else. Can I? I can't even do that. Ultimately, that person too needs to experience. Even me having experienced, how do I communicate that to someone else? It's not possible. Even with myself as the experiencer, having perfectly experienced that sweetness, ultimately, that person must taste. That person must experience. How far can we take this analogy? That person doesn't believe me. Person looks at that jar and just sees some brown gooey substance. They don't want to taste it. Well, I try my best to convince them. Maybe it'll take a day or two. Maybe longer, maybe shorter. But eventually they taste, and eventually they know. They know what I know. They themselves are having their own taste of that honey. So this is what it is like to experience bhakti. Once we experience this, and let's use the word that Narada is using right here, prema. Once we experience that prema, once we experience that divine love, once we experience that, there are no words that can help us. There's nothing within this material world that can help us to fully express what it means and its effect upon us. All that we can do is do our best to help others, to beg others, if necessary. Please trust me, you taste. You taste this as well. And then you'll know. Such is the nature of prema, of pure devotion, of pure love. Let's go on to 53. But sometimes pure devotion toward God is revealed to someone who has made himself qualified. Now, getting back to that storyline that I was giving before, I didn't know what honey was. After some time of speculation, I taste it. Now I know. There's someone else who doesn't know. I want to help them to understand it. They are skeptical. They don't necessarily want to understand it. They don't have the equipment, the ability to understand it. That is what this verse is speaking about. That one has to make himself qualified in order to understand it. Now, what is meant by qualification? What is meant by qualification? Of course, in the material realm, we have all sorts of ideas about what is meant by qualification, and all of them tend to be quantitatively oriented. All of them tend to be even heroically oriented. All of them tend to be oriented toward the acquisition of material things. But of course, are we talking about the acquisition of something material? Are we talking about the acquisition of gold, the acquisition of property, the acquisition of whatever material thing you can think of? Of course not. We're talking about the acquisition of something which, amazingly, we already have. See, we were born to taste the nectar of bhakti, of devotion. It's something that is innate to who we are, to our very soul, to our very Atman. That is what we are searching for. And yet, of course, how many people seek this? Not many. Not many in any one given spectrum of time and history. Not many people. Thus, what are these qualifications that are being spoken of? Yes, they're not material qualifications. Rather, they are qualifications that go to the very essence of who the person is. Because again, remember that verse 51, that first verse. We're talking about understanding the essential nature, the svarupa of prema. Understanding the essential nature of love of God. In order to understand that essential nature, we must understand that with our essential nature. Thus, we are to draw out what is in our essential nature as Atman, what is natural to us. Now, maybe we can begin to understand what is meant by these qualities that have to be brought out. So what are some of these qualities? Many, and we can only mention a few. Sincerity is very important. Dedication, very important. An ability, yes, to have discipline, to have focus, all of these important things, to have strength, to be on the path and stay on the path for the amount of time that is necessary. And then as a byroad, how much time is that? How much time is that? As much time as is necessary. For some people, they'll experience that bhakti theoretically in one day. Of course, now in actuality, it means that they were yogis previously. For some people, it will take a lifetime. For some people, it will take several lifetimes. Thus, this is an important qualification. Patience, patience, patience. And more, what gives us patience itself is faith. Because without understanding that there is indeed a goal that I can achieve, why would we have patience? Instead, we have faith in that goal. We understand, why am I doing this? Why am I doing sadhana? Why am I vegetarian? Why do I do all these things that I do? Why do I live a lifestyle that, while I know it's satisfying, while I know it's healthy, while I know that it's something that is absolutely wonderful and wondrous, still it makes me very different from all those around me. So it makes my life, in a way, quite difficult. Still, why do I pursue this nonetheless? Because I have some faith. Let's go a little deeper. Why do I have some faith? Because I have tasted. See? Because I have tasted. So, what we were talking about before, about how in verse 52, an individual has to actually taste. The truth of the matter is, everyone in this room has tasted. You haven't necessarily plunged deeply into that ocean of nectar. But even if it's been a few drops of that ocean of nectar, you've tasted. And you know it's real. And that knowing gives you faith. And that faith gives you patience. And that patience gives you the ability to traverse on the path of bhakti and of yoga in such a way that you will know its end. You will know its goal, its culmination. All right. What other qualities are important? Devotion itself. And like I said, I can talk about many qualities that a person has to cultivate, but I want to end with that. In order to gain devotional consciousness, in order to gain bhakti, one has to practice devotion itself. Thus, you've heard me say a million times that bhakti both is the path, but it's also the goal. But why is this the case? Why is it the case that to have bhakti, you have to practice bhakti? Why is this the case? Because you become like that upon which you focus, upon which you meditate, which you practice. Thus, It is by practicing bhakti that we develop bhakti, that we develop ultimately that devotion. So, very important quality. So, let's go on a little bit more to 54. Very good. And this is a somewhat longer verse, so we'll spend a little bit more time with this one. Devoid of all material qualities, devoid of all material desires, pure devotion toward God has as its essential form the most minutely subtle experience, ever increasing and never interrupted. Now, this is a very in-depth verse. We're going to spend a little bit of time with this. First of all, talking about these two negative things, that an individual who wishes to understand bhakti must be devoid of all material qualities. Devoid of all material qualities. Now, what is meant by that? That the person is not skilled in material things? No, of course not. We know that in actuality, yogis, sadhus, sages, etc. are very skilled in material things. But they are devoid of material qualities. In other words, in, again, their essential nature. You see, with these group of verses, keep this one theme in mind among other themes. Svarupa, essential nature. In the person's essential nature, while they are even doing material things, they are not expressing material qualities. They are not expressing material attributes. They are not expressing material desire, in other words. Okay, do we understand that distinction? Because again, a person might make the mistake of thinking that, okay, devoid of all material qualities, what does that mean? Well, a perfect yogi should not know how to do computer programming. Isn't that a material quality? No, it's just a skill. A skill is not a quality. These are skills. Oh, a perfect yogi should not know how to drive a car. A perfect yogi should not know business matters, etc., etc. Not what this verse is saying. Those are skills. But rather, this is talking about material qualities. In other words, you can have all the material skills imaginable and you can hone them to their absolute perfection. But you, in your essence, are not tainted by materialism. By material qualities, what does that mean? Kama, krodha, lobha. It means lust, anger, greed, etc. These are material qualities that the individual who is on the path, little by little, rids themselves of. And this is the thing that is amazing, and I've pointed this out so many times. When you purge yourself of material desires, interestingly, then when you attempt to accomplish something materially, you actually hone your material skills to absolute perfection. And it's only then that you can have complete success. It's only then that you can have complete success. This is why who is and who is not a perfected bhakta, an individual who has perfected bhakti yoga, can sometimes trick us. We can think, oh, this person can't be a yogi, and in actuality they are. And of course the opposite. We think, oh, look at this person. They look like a yogi, and in actuality, internally, they're not. Let me give this very nice story that I've only told a few times, actually. True story from Chaitanya Charitamritam. Very, very nice story. And I'll tell this in brief. Well, there was an individual who wanted to take initiation from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, very great sage, an Avesha avatar, very great perfected bhakta. And this person wanted to take initiation from him. And he approached Chaitanya and said, oh, Sri Chaitanya, would you please be my guru? And Chaitanya knew what he was doing. He said, no, I am not your guru. And the person was amazed. Really? Oh, why? Oh, you have a guru, but it's not me. There's a person, his name is Pundarika Vidyanidhi. You are to take initiation from him. And the person had heard that name before. Pundarika Vidyanidhi. Wait a minute, isn't that person some sort of merchant? Isn't he a really wealthy person who travels the world and sells things and makes a lot of money? And Chaitanya says, that's him. Approach him. He's going to be your guru. And this person was surprised, but he understood who Chaitanya was. So he went to the house of Pundarika Vidyanidhi. And when he arrived there, the servant brought him in. And he looked around this place and he was amazed. It was a mansion. Absolute mansion. There was wealth everywhere. There were beautiful rugs. There was art everywhere that was obviously from all over the world, places he had never visited in his life. And he could tell that, oh, this is the home of a very wealthy person. And then finally, the servant comes and says, yes, my master is ready. Please come to the next room and you can speak to him. And he's brought in and he sees Pundarika Vidyanidhi. And he's dressed very elaborately. He's wearing a turban and he has jewels. And he's sitting on a very beautiful seat. And he's surrounded by just wonderful, wonderful art and things that make it very obvious that this is a very worldly person. This is a very wealthy person. And again, he's confused. Why did Chaitanya tell me that this person is my guru? And he was there for a little while, and he tried to speak with him, but he couldn't get it still, even after talking to him. So he excused himself, he left. He went back to Chaitanya and he said, Mahaprabhu, Chaitanya, please forgive me, but I visited this Pundarika Vidyanidhi and he seems like a very materialistic person. Was I confused? Did you tell me he is my guru? And Chaitanya said, yes, he is your guru. Chaitanya, I don't want to doubt you, but how can that be? And Chaitanya explained, oh, no. You saw the external trappings that he wanted you to see. You didn't see the inner him, did you? You didn't see. This is what I want you to do. There is this verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, and he told him the verse. And it's from the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. And it describes the love of the gopis for Krishna. And he said, go back to Pundarika Vidyanidhi. And when you have a chance in your conversation, recite this verse to him. All right, I'll do that. And he goes back. And again, he's in this fabulously ornate room with Pundarika Vidyanidhi. And they're talking. And he didn't know how to quite bring this up. But then he finally said, can I share something with you? There's a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, from Bhagavata Purana, that I love very much, and I would love to hear your comments on it. And he tells him the verse. And again, it's a verse explaining the love that the gopis had for Krishna. And up until that point, Pundarika Vidyanidhi seemed like an ordinary person. But the moment he recited this verse to him in Sanskrit, singing it to him, Pundarika Vidyanidhi became like a statue. It is explained. He became very silent. And he began to just look forward in front of him as if he was seeing something that no one else was seeing. And as he stood there as a statue, the only movement that could be seen were tears that began to come from his eyes and kept flowing and going onto his beautiful ornate clothing, making them wet and stained, and onto the couch under him. And this Pundarika Vidyanidhi began to tremble and tremble as he continued crying. And then, all of a sudden, to the shock of this person who was there with him, he grabbed his very rich, very ornate, very expensive clothing, and he took his shirt and he ripped it, and he jumped onto the floor, and he just began to moan in ecstasy, thinking of Krishna, with tears continuing to come from his eyes, and shaking his entire body, shaking and shivering in ecstasy. At this point, the person understood who Pundarika Vidyanidhi was, the true him. And he understood Chaitanya was right. This is his guru. And when he became composed again, he asked Pundarika Vidyanidhi for initiation. And he agreed. So, one's Svarupa, one's inner essence. Ultimately, we don't want to know the form, the Rupam. We want to know the Svarupam, the inner essence of things, of people, of God, of Bhakti. So, devoid of all material qualities, devoid of all material desires. So again, the second clause to further elaborate and elucidate the first clause. So devoid of all material qualities, and why? Because one is devoid of all material desires. Pure devotion, prema, toward God has as its essential form the most minutely subtle experience. The most minutely subtle experience. What is the highest? What is the deepest? What is truth? What is bhakti? What is God? What is spirit? What is consciousness? What is the highest thing that we can think of in its ultimate essence? It is something that only can be experienced. Why? I have to stop there, stopping halfway through the thought. Why can it only be experienced? There is a reason why it can only be experienced. Because what are we? Drashtar. We are experiencers at our very what? Essence. It can only be experienced. Number one. Number two, that experience is minutely subtle. What is meant by that? What is meant by that is, and I'll try to explain this simply. When you go up the hierarchy of ontological being, what happens? You go from the gross to the less gross, to the subtle, to the more subtle, to the most subtle, to that which is beyond even the most subtle. You go to the minutely subtle. What is meant by that? What is meant by that is bhakti in its deepest essence has zero materiality within it. It is not only of the nature of consciousness, but it is so of the nature of consciousness that within that plane of consciousness there is nothing pure. There is nothing pure. There is nothing deeper. There is nothing higher. There is nothing sweeter than that pure love of God. This is what is meant by what is the actual inner essence of bhakti. It is minutely subtle experience, and we are the experiencer of that. Envision that. This is the nature of bhakti. This is the nature of prema, divine love of God. And more, as if understanding its inner essence as this was not enough. More than this. It is ever increasing and it is never interrupted. Two very important attributes, qualifying attributes of that bhakti, of that prema, of that divine love of God, that devotional consciousness. That A, it is ever increasing. Imagine this. Imagine this. Ever increasing. As it is, bhakti is the subtlest of all subtle things. It is the very juice, the very nectar of consciousness itself. If one were to describe bhakti, it is the nectar, the juice of consciousness itself. Imagine this. But more, that experience of that bliss, of that ecstasy, is ever increasing. Now those are just two words. Let me explain why they're significant. Ever increasing in what context? A material context? Is that all that's meant by this? In other words, okay, if you could put a number The ecstasy of love of God is from 1 to 10. Oh, let's say it's a 5. Oh, but then it becomes a 6. Oh, but then it becomes a 7. Is this what we're talking about by ever increasing? No. We're talking about ever increasing to the enumeration of boundlessness. To the enumeration of boundlessness. It is ever increasing to the point of infinity. Imagine a bliss and ecstasy that increases to the point of infinity. In other words, it never stops increasing. That's number one. Number two, it is never interrupted. It is never interrupted. What is never interrupted? It is eternal. Thus, again, material increase. Wealth, strength, you go to the gym every day, you pump iron, etc. Anything that you can put some numerical value on. Eventually you reach a limit, do you not? Eventually you can only become so wealthy. Of course, you tell extremely wealthy people that, many of them don't believe that, so they'll keep trying to become wealthier and wealthier. But no, there is a limit to how wealthy you can become, to how strong you can become, to how healthy you can become, to how whatever material thing you are thinking of. There is a limit. But imagine ever increase without interruption. That is, within the scope of eternality. That is the nature of bhakti. That is the nature of what we're talking about. That is the nature of the goal of why we are here in this building right now. Why are we here? Why do we do what we do? The goal is to experience this. A bliss this amazing. All right. And this is going to be the last verse now that we'll do for now, because then another theme will begin after 55. But now verse 55. Now, upon obtaining what we've just been talking about, that prema, that pure devotional awareness and consciousness of God, of the divine. Now, this is what this verse is talking about. Upon obtaining that pure devotion toward God, all right, one sees only God, one hears only about God, one speaks only about God, and one's thoughts are only upon God. Perfect, pure God consciousness. This is what it means. This is what it means. This is the goal, ultimately. This is the goal, is to achieve this form of consciousness, such that with everything we do, with everything we think, with everything we say, with every fiber of our being, what is there is our source. What is there is that which we love. What is there is the divine, God, Bhagavan, Sriman Narayana, in such a way that we have eternal relationship with God in loving reciprocation. This is a verse 55 of chapter 4 of the Narada Bhakti Sutras, that explains perfectly what is the goal of all spirituality. What is the goal of yoga? What is the goal of Vedanta? What is the goal of anything that is good in this world and beyond this world? So let me just read this again, because it's a powerful verse. Upon obtaining that pure devotion toward God, one sees only God, one hears only about God, one speaks only about God, and one's thoughts are only upon God. In other words, one is thoroughly absorbed in such a manner that at all times God is the very center of your being. There is nothing for you in existence but God. Nothing in existence for you but God. You live for God in every way. This one verse I can talk about for another 2 hours probably, but I won't. Instead, I'd rather stop right here for now and see if there are any questions. And the reason why I'm going to stop right here, right now, is because these verses that we've gone through, are extremely deep. You've seen that. These verses are giving us a glimpse, a little peek into what it means to live in the divine without falling, in utter perfection. What this little section is explaining is beyond mere liberation, beyond mere samadhi. So, very beautiful, very, very deep last few verses. Verses 51 to 55 of Narada Bhakti Sutras. Please.
On the one hand, it sounds wonderful that this devotion to God is ever increasing and never interrupted. But on the other hand, it sounds either scary or impossible, because if in our human experience, anything that we have only a finite capacity, if you just run too much electricity through a person, you destroy him. He can only take so much. So what is it about this bhakti that you can have more and more and not be destroyed?
That's actually a very good question. You actually answered the question yourself in your question. In our human experience, that is the case. In our human experience, yeah, you're right, we're limited. We can only eat so much, our belly will explode. We can only read so much, consume so much information, eventually, we'll have a nervous breakdown, etc., etc. We are talking about an experience that is experienced by Atman itself, by unbounded consciousness itself. We're not talking about something that is experienced by a bound being. And having said that, it's not even that in order to experience precisely what we were just looking at, it's not that the person necessarily even has to be free right then from the body, or the mind, or the intellect, or the emotions, etc. Rather, the person understands that he is none of those things, and he is experiencing this in his consciousness itself. Thus, this is why a person can experience this, but at the same time continue in this world. So, number one, this experience is not being experienced by a bound being, but rather by Atman, by consciousness itself. Again, the essential being. Remember, that essential person, that Svarupa, that was also one of the themes of these last few verses. It is the essential being of the person who is experiencing the essential being of bhakti, in expression toward, interestingly, the essential being of God. And if you understand that that essential being is ever free, it is one of its attributes to be free, one of its attributes to be omniscient, one of its attributes to not be bound, it can indeed experience bhakti to an infinite degree for an infinite period of time, and even then, in a positive way, thirst for more. Even experiencing that love infinitely for an infinite amount of time, not only does it not get full and explode, it wants more. And there's more to be given. Thus, it's inexpressible. Remember how we began this. It's inexpressible. You're trying to understand the unlimited via limited means. Yeah, the body is limited, the mind is limited, everything that we are materially is limited. Not on the plane of consciousness. On the plane of consciousness, there is nothing but limitlessness. Does that make sense? Have faith. Have faith, have devotion. You'll experience this. All right, anyone else?
What if a person is not particularly a devotional type? Can he develop devotion, even if he's a very dry, kind of intellectual type?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Through prasada, through grace. Yeah. Through grace. Because, all right, let's take that example. I can't think of anyone like that who I know, but let's take let's take that example. Person is somewhat dry, philosophical, intellectual type. Is that really who they are? That's temporary. That's just external personality. That's just persona. That's just the combination of karma over many, many lifetimes, coupled with environmental experience in this particular lifetime, coupled with genetic factors, coupled with. But the real person is none of that. The real person is the Atman. And the essential attribute of Atman is to love, is to have devotion. So it's a matter merely of transcending that persona and discovering the personality, the true spiritual personality. Yeah. For that matter, a person can be anything. Create any combination of disparate personality elements, put them together. What if a person is such and such? What if a person is this? Can they develop bhakti? Yes, because they are none of that. They are none of that. Ultimately they are Atman. Ultimately they are consciousness. And consciousness exists to love. That really is its purpose, is to have devotion, is to have bhakti. That is the nature of consciousness. So what you're really describing is, what is our entire process? Yes, transcend the persona, transcend the temporary personality traits, and know the person who lies within. Know that svarupa of the Atman, that inner being, that inner essence of the Atman. Then you'll know bhakti. And how do you know that? A lot of effort, but also grace. Prasada, grace. And you're not dry. Anyone else, please?
How does one overcome skepticism and cynicism when attempting to experience bhakti?
That is an excellent question. By experiencing itself, by experiencing, and not thinking about it too much. Where does cynicism and skepticism come from? It comes from overanalyzing and thinking something to death that was not meant to be thought about more so than experienced to begin with. So in other words, again, what is bhakti? It is an experience. When it's thought about too much to the point of overanalysis, what ends up happening is you don't understand it and it remains a mystery. Thus the skepticism, thus the cynicism. Why are we cynical about something? Because it's a mystery to us. Because someone says, oh, such and such is great, but we never experienced it. So what are we? We're skeptical and we're cynical. Correct? That's the basis of skepticism and cynicism. We know nothing about it. Someone is making a claim. Oh, how do you know that's the case? How can you be telling me that? What's the answer? You haven't experienced it yet. So the way that we rid ourselves of skepticism and cynicism in relation to bhakti is to experience bhakti. Now, as I say that, I don't mean necessarily the way this very last verse is saying, that is with such intensity and depth, but just a drop. Just a drop. You see in the lives of great sages and great bhaktas very specifically, how very often indeed all they needed was one drop of that experience. And that one drop alone was enough to sustain them for the rest of their lives as they continued to pursue that experience again and again and again. It's kind of like having an experience which you have it, and it's so perfect an experience that now you have no choice but to chase after that experience for the rest of your life, except, unlike other material experiences, this experience is real. This experience is real. And once you've tasted it, you will chase it for the rest of your life, except you will attain it. But it begins with that first experience. So wait till that first experience comes, if it hasn't already. And then pursue it, and you'll see that experience getting deeper and deeper and showing you that it's real. Again, not philosophically or intellectually, but within. You begin to experience something that you've never experienced before, but yet that is so vivid that it's more vivid than anything you have experienced before. That's how you know it's real. That's what keeps the yogi going, is precisely that. When you have an experience that is like nothing you have ever experienced before, but that is so real and so vivid that it is unlike anything else that you have experienced before. Thus you know it's real. And you chase that. And you chase that. The process of chasing, that's called sadhana. That's called yoga. That's the process. Yeah. Otherwise, cynicism, skepticism, no books, no verbal answers, no anything like that can really chase that away, unless you're taking a fully intellectual approach to begin with, in which case, even once it's chased away, you'll only accept intellectually. You understand what I'm saying? So you don't want an intellectual answer, because then you'll only have intellectual satisfaction. You don't want mere intellectual satisfaction. You want to taste. Does that make sense? Very good. Please.
So is verse 54 pretty much saying that if someone has pure devotion, that they would, in the beginning, they would tend to it would just be a subtle experience in most cases in the beginning?
No. It's saying the opposite, actually. This is not talking about beginning stages. This is talking about, what this is talking about is the very nature of bhakti itself. That bhakti itself is a minutely subtle experience. So it's not really talking about the experiencer and how the experiencer is experiencing. Rather, it's talking about the experience itself, bhakti as the experience. You understand? It's saying as an experience, it is minutely subtle. It is the subtlest of all things. It's talking about the swarupa, the essence of bhakti.
So can I infer from that and say that if someone had that experience, it would be subtle or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then it says it's ever growing. So.
Mm-hmm. It's subtle in its essence in what it is. In what it is. In its finer point of what it is. It is the subtlest of subtle. But that subtlest of subtle can be experienced to an ever-increasing degree, and permanently so, eternally so. You understand? I think you're confusing the essence of the thing with the experience of the essence of the thing. Right? Does that make sense or no?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it's not talking about the experience, but I guess, but I could infer from it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, actually, perfect. Yes, you can infer from what this is saying that the experience of that is ever increasing and goes on permanently, goes on forever, is never interrupted. Yeah. But more, this is talking about the svarupa of bhakti, of prema, actually, prema. Prema just really being another expression of bhakti as bhakti is experienced. Prema, again, English translations, it's translated as love. There is no translation for prema. Love is a bad translation, but that's about as close as we can get. Divine love. that make sense? Very good. Dharmaraja, you had another question?
Yeah. No, I'll pass on that because my question is so subtle I can't figure out what it is.
Is it minutely subtle, though?
It's getting there.
All right. Very good. All right, this will be the last question.
Yes, so how does this process avoid making the person more and more self-absorbed and more indifferent to other beings rather than more compassionate?
Because the very process is the very opposite of what you've said. The very process is the opposite of self-absorption, it's self-surrender. The very process itself is the opposite of becoming callous to other living beings, but rather developing love. It is the path of love. It is the path of subsidiary of love, compassion.